has devoted his professional life to the objective of something difficult, of making economics as widely available and easily understandable as possible, and having fun doing it. And so he has acquired immense popularity. He's so very well loved in Ireland. And I owe the knowledge and, the fact that I found out about David McWilliams to Catherine Dunne, an extremely popular author, especially in Italy, where everybody loves her. She is the author of 10 published novels. Her one work of nonfiction, and Unconsidered People, is a social history that explores the lives of Irish immigrants in London in the 50s. Among her novels, The Things We Know Now, which won the Giovanni Boccaccio International Prize for Fiction in 2013, and was shortlisted for Novel of the Year at the Irish Book Award. The years that followed was published in 2016 and was longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award. And in 2019, she was the recipient of the Irish Pen Award for Outstanding Contribution to Irish Literature. She's also in the jury of the International Strega Prize, which is one of the most well-known literary prizes in Italy. So who best would introduce and create this bridge between Italian culture and Irish culture, and having Dante as the means for this conversation is really a wonderful opportunity for us all. So thank you, Catherine, for being part of this. And I know David has already spoken, and you must have heard his considerations. I'm sure he has so many things he wants to add to what he has already said. As Francisco mentioned, please do ask your questions on the chat room so that we can gather the questions and then propose them to David. And you have more than an hour to talk about Dante, money, pandemics, and the present world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Renata. I'm just going to jump in before David does, because I know that once he starts, I won't get a word in edgewise. So I was just very struck by something, David, which was spoken about this afternoon. We had two wonderful workshops throughout the day with Professor Carai. And something that he was emphasizing in Dante this afternoon was something we touched on in our talk, where I was asking you about corruption and poor leadership. And what came up this afternoon was the worst sin of all in Dante's world is the sin of pride. And I was wondering if you could tie that into what we were discussing earlier. And he also gives what I thought were just really human examples of how, if you like, the leaders and those in charge of money, which are often the same thing, but not always, but how they had cheated the populace. And in one example, somebody who shortchanged the people who came to him their measure of salt. So it was almost as though, again, another form of corruption, making money out of shortchanging people, which of course immediately made us think about Irish banks. But anyway, so I just wanted to throw that ball to you and see how you would respond.
Well, I mean, Catherine, the expression, he's a good skin, he's worth his salt, comes from somewhere. It actually comes from the fact that salt, for many hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, was the main currency, particularly around the northern Mediterranean. I mean, we're talking around North Africa. In actual fact, I think most of the salt mines were around Morocco. And there was an extraordinary exchange, if you've ever been to Marrakesh, between slaves from what was Timbuktu, which did exist. Many people think it was a sort of a making-up place, but it existed, and the salt traders, the Arab salt traders. In terms of pride and bankers or whatever, see, I think, having read as much as I could understand about Dante, that he didn't actually hate banks, but he hated bankers. And I was digging a wee bit more, and I realized that he actually sent his son to a banking school. So let's take the idea of do what I do, not what I say. There were schools introduced in the mid 14th or early 14th century into Florence, actually all over Italy, which were based on the mathematics of a guy called Fibonacci. And Fibonacci brought mathematics to the peninsula from Sicily, from the port of Marsala. And the port of Marsala, Marsala means Mars al-Allah, which means the mouth of Allah. And so it shows you there was a huge Arabic influence in the south of Italy, not surprisingly, geographically. And the Arabs got zero from the Hindus, okay? So the zero is the key to understanding the whole thing, that the Hindus figured out zero in around the 4th or 5th century in a place called Varanasi. And they were trading with the Arabs. And of course, we were not trading with the Arabs because the Crusaders had come in and said, you can't talk to these people. But the Italians figured out mathematics in the mid 13th century and brought it to Florence. And by 1330, just before the outbreak of the Black Death, there were 1,000 Florentine kids going to schools called reckoning schools. And reckoning schools were non-religious mathematical schools, which were like business schools. They taught the mathematics of business, and they taught double entry bookkeeping, and they taught the use of zeros and debits and credits. So I'm not sure, you know, it's a bit like where Labour politicians in England talk about the public health service and talk about public education, but they send their kids to posh schools, to private schools. So Dante was actually sending his kid, maybe he was in exile at this stage and his missus was doing it, to a school that embraced the actual intellectual foundation of banking, which was the mathematics of banking. So my view of the whole thing is that, from what I can see, he was a lot more complex, a lot more human, a lot less black and white. And his view on bankers was obviously framed by the corruption of the time, a bit like our own view of bankers it was something that I was railing against during the middle of this, the boom many years ago, that this was just simply a credit splurge and it wasn't any great economic miracle. But to come back to our friend Dante and the idea that he didn't like people double crossing him, and certainly this is why I picked out your man, poor old, the maestro Adam, because it seemed to me that Dante had reserved an extraordinary punishment for a guy who had debased the currency. And therefore, it's clear to me that Dante understood the power of the currency in the same way as Tom Wolfe, the great satirist of the Americans, understood the power of the dollar, or even Charles Dickens understood the power of sterling, or even Balzac. You know, you take all the great, satirists, the people who are actually using poetry or literature or the novel to attack the status quo. It doesn't mean, I think, that they actually wanted to throw the entire baby out with the bathwater, which was the system. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the punishment reserved from the counterfeiter, he puts the counterfeiter of the florin with a guy called Sinon of Troy. And Sinon of Troy was the geezer who double-crossed the Trojans, Catherine, and persuaded them that the actual wooden horse of Troy was a gift from the gods and not actually the thing in which the Greeks were hiding. And Sinon managed to betray the Trojans, allow the Greeks in. The Greeks hung out in the belly of the horse. When the Trojans went to the scratcher, they got out of the horse, opened the gates, the Greek army were ready for them, and they destroyed the Trojans. So think about the scurrilous betrayal of that act. And the fact now that Dante decided to put a fella, Adam, and you think about what was Adam's crime. Adam's crime was that the florin was a 24-carat gold, so it was pure gold. And the carat, amazingly, was the weight of the pod of a certain tree. This is the mad stuff you learn when you read about Dante. I didn't know all this stuff before, you know. That basically, you know, there's a certain tree that grows in the Mediterranean, which is about 20 little pods in it, like a runner bean, like a Mediterranean runner bean, right? And amazingly, every single one of the pods of that, the little seeds, have exactly the same weight, irrespective of the size of the tree. Isn't that amazing? And that was the carrot. And then you took 24 of those pods and you put in one side of the scale and the gold in the other. And if it was 24, if it weighed, you were fine. But poor Adam decided to take out 3 bits of gold of the 24 and add in 3 bits of copper. And that was in about 1285. So Dante would have been about 20 odd, maybe a wee bit older, about 25. And the interesting thing is what we forget is that, and poor Adam was burned at the stake, right?
Okay.
2 things are interesting. One is that the burning at the stake was obviously something people saw a lot of. Like we think, Jesus, how could you see something like that? But obviously Dante was seeing this carry on quite a lot in Florence. He was burned at the stake for the crime of, as you would say, undermining the trust of the Florentines in this thing called the florin. Second thing is that Adam was English. And that interested me too, because I thought, okay, how will an English geezer be in Florence? Because our understanding, at least my understanding of that time in the world, was that people didn't travel that much. Okay, our sense of it is that it was a very isolated world. And then you dig a bit deeper, and on the contrary, it was an incredibly cosmopolitan world, incredibly cosmopolitan. So Adam rocks up to Italy to learn about commerce because the Italians were so far ahead of everybody else. And the English would have been very well aware of Florence because the English were exporting what? Exporting wool to the Florentines. So then it got me thinking about, could you imagine the crack they had in Florence, right? It must have been amazing. It's this big cosmopolitan city that's Republican. It doesn't have a monarch. It's slightly against the, even the way they've minted the florin. They had St. John on one side, okay, and the fleur de lis on the other, okay? So what they were basically saying to the church is like, we're kind of equal to you, On the one side, we got St. John and we genuflected that stuff, but on the other side, we have ourselves. So that must have been incredibly exciting at the time. So to come back to your question, I think you're absolutely right that amongst bankers in booms, they misdiagnose other people's money. I mean, for a miracle. I mean, the interesting thing about banks, and it's the case, Catherine, since the medieval age, is that banks go bad from the inside out.
Absolutely.
This is what we've got to understand.
Well, we've plenty of experience of that, haven't we?
And the easiest way to rob a bank is to run it. So think about that, right? No, seriously, right? Think about it. So when I was a kid, if you had a bank robber, you had a fellow with swag and he got over the wall, right? Actually, in fact, most banks are robbed from the inside out. Okay. And the easiest way, it's called in economics control fraud, where you actually create a fraud from inside the banking system. And if you look at the Irish banks and all the banks in the last 10 or 20 years, they had this very bizarre thing, Catherine, is they linked the pay of the chief executive to the share price. So that meant that the chief executive had a massive internal personal interest in driving up the share price.
The share price.
So how do you drive up the share price of a bank? Is you overlend, right? You lend too much money, okay? And because you're being enriched. So in a way, the extraordinary thing about banking is you tie the credibility and the underlying financial stability of the bank to the personal bank account of the chief executive, and you get a disaster. And that's what happened in Ireland, and I believe what happened in Florence too.
Is this why this whole capitalist cycle of boom and bust happens with such regularity, or part of the reason? When I was doing the research for the book about Irish immigrants in London, those who left here in that dismal decade of the 1950s, all of the reading I did up to that time seemed to indicate to me that the cycle of massive amounts of credit, overlending, as you've described it, and then the collapse or the crash took maybe 30 years for that cycle to complete itself. Now it seems to me in recent years, we're doing this every 10 years.
Yeah, we are.
So what are the reasons behind that, apart from bankers with inflated sense of their own value?
Well, it's an interesting thing, Catherine, because if you go back to the 1950s, it's an amazing story that 500,000 Irish people emigrated to England, nowhere else, to England alone. And anybody who enjoys the Irish football team will remember the great Jack Charlton football team, which were largely made up of the sons of those people. I remember people called them plastic paddies, and they weren't. They were the sons of poor people, largely from the west of Ireland. That's who they were, right? The Andy Townsends of this, except for Tony Cascarino, who was actually Italian. He wasn't Irish at all, right? And he fessed up. So the interesting thing about the 50s is the 50s might have been so traumatic in Ireland because of a total absence of credit. Okay, so the economy was totally contracted. So it's hard for us to understand now that the Irish balance of payments at the time was maintained by emigrants' remittances.
Remittances,
So
yeah.
people sending from Wolverhampton, from Birmingham, from North London, right? It's a totally different world. And
sorry, and apparently we were the only country in the world, Dave, that actually listed emigrant remittances as part of our national income because they were so astonishing.
they're so huge.
I remember one of the figures I came across was in 1961. The entire educational budget for this state, and that was primary, secondary and university, came to £13.4 million. The value of the emigrant remittances, and these are the ones that officialdom could trace, because lots of other money came in envelopes and birthday cards and so on that nobody could actually put a value on. But the value of those remittances that they could trace in those years equaled the entire educational budget of this country. So essentially,
sure.
The people who left in the 1950s educated an entire generation.
No, I think you're absolutely right. As my dad used to say, the Easter Lily in Dunleary Church, which was given out and paid for the local RA, was largely paid for by wages of the RAF that were sent over from fellows working in RAF factories. Right. But let's go back to Dante. Let's go back to Dante and money, right? The boom busts that Dante experienced are a function of a number of things. The main one is human nature, right? That I'm not that harsh on people. I think that, when I look at negative equity in Ireland, I think most people went into negative equity for love, not greed. Because if you actually look at what happened, most people who bought houses during that boom were just kind of settling down. They were in love. And somebody said, you're in love, buy a house. Now, nobody who's in love is going to second guess and say, oh, your man McWilliams on the telly, he was saying don't buy them. You do things, human nature is, you have kids, you worry about, okay. So we go back to, there's a great economist, if you want to understand these booms and busts, there's two of them, one fellow called Kindleberger and another lad called Minsky. And they talked about these cycles, right? That they're all the same, that all boom and bust cycles go through about 7 phases. And in the end, all it is all the good stuff, Catherine, lust and greed and thinking that you're this time will be different. It's this human oscillation between greed and fear and greed and fear. And it's back to that idea of human nature that we don't know what we want. And we are incredibly suggestible and we're not scientific. And economics starts with this notion that humans are scientific and analytical and cold and calculating. And we know we're not. And as I said the last time, and we gossip and we yarn and so my sense is that once you add credit into the mix, I mean, the beautiful thing about credit is you get money that you haven't earned. What's wrong with that, right? Everybody loves a bit of that, right? And you get money that you haven't earned in order to have a lifestyle that you haven't earned. Again, that's what people want. So it's a funny thing, Catherine, I'm not that harsh on the individuals who get caught up in the effervescence of the moment.
Absolutely.
I am much harsher on the regulators whose job it is. And equally, even the bankers, if you look at, that's what they do. They lend money. Like, why do you think that suddenly John the Baptist is going to arrive in a Gucci suit and run Anglo-Irish Bank? They don't do that sort of shit. What they do is they lend money. My concern, even back then, being on prime time and all that malarkey, was on the regulators, Catherine. The people whose job was to say, hold on, this is not right. And they not only were asleep at the wheel, they were playing golf with the very bankers.
Absolutely.
And why is that? Because they wanted to hang around with people they thought were cool. I worked in the central bank years ago as a young fella, and I was really intrigued at the asymmetry between the regulators and the bankers, in the sense that the bankers would take the regulators. So basically, the rich private sector guys would take the scrimping public sector guys to Gibo's for lunch, right? And they'd come back from Gibo's and they'd be all excited, name dropping about who they were out for lunch with. Human nature. They'd say, let's go for golf. Let's go and watch the Irish rugby team. Let's go and watch the Irish soccer team in Paris when your man handled the ball twice, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean, right?
You still remember that one.
Look, you've got to remember that stuff. Forget Dante. It's that handball. But my point is that the the cops should never be in awe of the robbers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As a general rule.
Yeah.
And if you understand that banks are robbed by their own executives, then you should always be on your guard. This is why I believe we should pay regulators much more than we pay bankers.
Sure.
Because the reason the regulators were so palsy-walsy with the bankers is there was a status mismatch between income and the goodies and the cars and la, 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 la. And so I think it's a bit like, if you want a good education system, pay teachers well.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
You know?
So listen, tell me then, in the reading that you, in the studying you've been doing around Dante's Florence, what was their equivalent of a regulator back in the 12th and the 13th centuries? Do you know?
Well, they had their guilds, right? So the guilds were supposed to be paternalistic, okay? And they were in the main. But you see, again, what I want to explain is that money was really new. It was really exciting. Think about it. They were going from a situation that had pertained since the fall of the Roman Empire, where money was entirely the preserve of the feudal lord and the Pope, right? And suddenly these banker guys come around and they're quite revolutionary. There would not have been a social revolution in Florence without a money revolution. This is always the case. Money is a revolutionary energy. So that's why, for example, the American revolutionaries printed their own money to fight the English. The French revolutionaries printed their own money to fight the monarch, right? All revolutions are driven by finance. And they're fueled by finance. And in the same way, I look at the introduction of money into Florence as a profoundly liberating energy that was really new. They'd never figured this out. So the idea that you could lose your shirt and your cousin's shirt and your cousin's mate's shirt on some Ponzi scheme, also an Italian, Mr. Ponzi, remember him? He arrived in America in the early 20th century. I think it was new to them, right? So what I look at, I know it sounds weird, but the excitement of the city, fueled by the aspirations of, you think the city goes from a population of 20,000 to 120,000. That's like Dublin going to a population from 1 million to 2 million.
2 million, yeah.
And imagine the excitement of that, and the crack they were having, and the bars that were opening, and the fun and the revolutionary ideas. And I think that is at the core of the Ghibelline Guelph crisis. Was basically, the Guelphs were the Aravisti merchant class, and they were saying to the Ghibellines, listen, man, we've been under the cosh for you for years, and now this thing called money is liberating us, and we don't have to take. And it's a bit like, I've always remembered, like in Ireland during the Celtic Tiger, the people who most aggressively hated the Celtic Tiger were dentists, I always remember.
Really?
The reason is that dentists were always quite posh, right? They'd established themselves. They made money taking people's teeth out, which is a profoundly unusual thing to do, right? If you think about it, okay? Like no kid says, oh, when I grow up, I want to take daddy's teeth out. It's not really something to do, right? But what I'm saying is the lawyers and the dentists and the medics, they were much more aggressive against the jumped up builders, developers, plumbers, and brickies who were buying houses in Dublin 4 than the rest of us who were kind of chilled with the social churn. Sure, and that's what I think that social churn driven by money threatens the status quo, not because the status quo then wants to throw up barriers to the new rich. And the new rich, if they've got money, the only barriers you can throw up to them, Catherine, are barriers, what I would call affectations.
Yeah.
So manners, pedigree, the way you hold your knife and fork, how your missus dresses, all that sort of stuff.
How old your family is,
all that. The great thing about Irish people, we've no idea. I've no idea who my great-grandparents were. No idea at all.
So listen, what have you learned then about Dante's time, about the social stratification that would have existed pre-boom in Florence and post-boom? Can you give us any sense of that?
Yeah, I think that what was going on was a massive, a bit like Dickens. Like what gave Dickens all his ammunition? Right? Even Jane Austen, what gave her the ammunition was the Industrial Revolution, the churn that was happening, the fact that the Bennets and the Darcys, all these great literary devices, the Great Gatsby, all these things, Balzac's stuff, it's all about the threat posed to the old order by the new social class. And the new social class understand money much better than the old social class. And that's why I find money in the abstract a beautifully complicated, revolutionary thing. I agree with you that we can get greedy and we can be, you know, people with too much money can lose the run themselves. But if you look at it as a social technology almost, right? It's a technology, and people who can use it, you know, so you see that all the time. And it's the great thing, Catherine, you know, as a novelist, right? You know, it's a beautifully rich soil for social observation.
Sure.
And I think that's what Dante was at, although he was obviously very fed up. And as I said before, vengeance is a beautiful thing when you're writing.
Indeed. And listen, you said something, you just said something a minute ago, actually, which sparked something also. This afternoon, what we were looking at it was astonishing, the recurrence of the number 7 in so many ways. It was the 7 deadly sins, for example, that we were talking about. And you were talking about the 7 phases of the boom and bust. And in Purgatorio, the penitent has his 7 P's carved across his forehead of all of the sins of which he's guilty, and the worst of those was pride. But just to move that aside just for a moment, you started in our earlier talk looking at some of the letter P, if you like, that you associated with Florence and Dante's time. And I don't think we had time to actually finish going through all of those P's. So can you continue?
Just on the 7, the reason 7 was regarded as quite evil in the old days is you can't divide it into anything.
Okay.
So if you look at this is like, so there's a, if you look at, for example, the reason there are 12 apostles, the reason there's a dozen, okay, right, is because 12 is divisible in very many ways, 2s and 6s and 3s and 4s, right? So it's a very useful number, okay? And the 7 is not a useful number. And therefore 7 took a wee bit like this idea of right and left handed. The sinister was the sinistra, the left hand. The 7 took on a sort of a slightly evil connotation because it was not actually useful. The P's, I can't remember where we got to. I think what
the purple was certainly one.
Okay, so the purple is
on purple.
Yeah, well, no, the purple is the purple is a beautiful thing, you know, because the purple is what begins the great story of innovation. Okay, that's the beautiful one. And then the idea was the second P. Well, the second P wasn't a P at all. It was a G. It was the invention of glasses. This is an enormously important thing. So the young Florentines go east in the same way as Irish kids went to America for the J1s, right? To see something new, which Donald Trump actually banned today.
Yes, I saw that.
I would have thought in the overall leagues of threats to the Americans, the Irish student on a J1 is hardly up there. But anyway, nonetheless, right? The second thing they discover at the same time is the use of this little small technology. So if you imagine the glasses now, right? We all take it for granted. But somebody figuring out to use your nose as a ballast and your ears, okay, think about it, as stabilizers for a technology that would allow you see and prolong the artisan's life. Because the key then was like these things here, mind, the hands-free. The key to glasses wasn't understanding that convexity rectified short-sightedness. The key was figuring out an invention that you could do things with your hands-free. And the Florentine figured that out. And that's a huge invention because that means then that you become hyper-productive because you double the life of the artisan, because normally we start to lose our sight in our 40s. And if you lose your sight in your 40s, it means you can't deal with precision, any sort of precision tool. So you need to be able to work with very small things. And why is precision? The people that figured out precision figured out mechanical clocks, okay? This is another huge important. So you go around Florence, and there's lots of clocks, okay? Why was the clock so important? Because the clock allowed them to create an organization structure around productivity. So you had 10 hours in the day and you did this, because prior to that, you were waiting for the cockerel to crow. Are you right? And there was no sense of being able to organize society on a precise productivity basis. So all these things are
the beginnings of the working day then, was it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So you know that great French think Frere Jacques Dormez-vous, you know? So that's all about the fact that people woke up when Frere Jacques, the monk, rang the bell.
Okay.
So if Frere Jacques fell asleep, nobody woke up, right? And that's a medieval song about, where are you, Frere Jacques? Where are you? We need to get out of bed. So up until then, they were waiting for the monasteries, which worked on water clocks and sundials, to signal what was going on. If you allow people work with precision engineering, you can figure out mechanical clocks, and then you can spread these. And the most amazing thing about 15th, 16th century Italy was the proliferation of watches, which must have been incredibly exciting as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you could tell people what time, and nobody ever knew what time it was. So then the other amazing thing that the Florentines had was the pressure in the Arno River. And this was incredibly important for doing two things. One was driving water mills, which is actually what gave them the energy. And the second was cleaning the cloth before they dyed the cloth. So the higher the water pressure, the better you have it cleaning, right?
Yes.
And then you have this, and the other thing about remember I told you about the power of P?
Yes, yes.
And that was incredible. The Florentines figured out that P is an incredibly valuable thing.
The
and
ammonia, wasn't it?
It's the ammonia, because it cleans stuff, but also what it does is it brings out the purple in the lichen. And I told you that the Romans had this great expression, which is pecunia non olet, which means money does not smell, which came to be understood that the provenance of money doesn't matter, but in actual fact, it was a reference to a tax on piss that Vespasian introduced because piss was valuable. And then the Senate were saying, man, you can't be, his elders were saying, you can't be taxing this pee, it's so smelly. And he said, I don't care. In fact, the Romans coveted after Portuguese pee. There's a strange one, isn't it? Okay. Right. They thought Portuguese pee was the most sulfuric of all pee. So any Portuguese people and the point is that the Florentines brought this all together in the 13th century. And this I find amazingly interesting.
That's probably not a conversation I would have with any Portuguese friends, but we'll move on from there for a moment, because I just also want to say to you that if I am correct, the word peccato, which also starts with a P, is a sin in Italian, isn't that correct? Yeah. What is the biggest, and I'm just moving from Dante's world to ours, because we're moving between eternities this week at the summer school, just moving between his world and ours. What, in your view, is the biggest sin that was committed in economics or in managing money to help, build a society which went for the public good in Dante's time, if they did? And what's the biggest sin today in trying to use our money in making our people healthy and safe?
Okay, wow, bloody hell. Well, from what I know, the public good, if you imagine the Florentine Republic wasn't like a republic in our sense. It was like a bourgeoisie democracy of the guilds and whatever, right? And they built really nice buildings, right? They also educated a hell of a lot of people. They also, if you think that after the Black Death was quite interesting, because the Black Death happened and you would think that this would have destroyed the economy of Florence, but it did the opposite, because the people who were left, there were fewer people and still the same amount of wealth. So the wealth of people rose enormously. And then you have this chompy revolution, this peasant revolution in, I think, 1370 or whatever. So there was lots of dynamics going on about people wanting more of the social realm. In our sense, Catherine, I know it sounds really weird, but I think the biggest error is that most economists don't understand money. Okay. I've always been intrigued it's a very interesting thing. Why are economists not rich? As a general rule, right? They're not, these are not people who understand money. And the reason they don't understand money is, I think, the vast majority live in a closeted world. It's like an old monastery, whether you're in the banks or in academia. Okay, so you're not out cutting and thrusting, doing your deals, understanding that you need a certain amount of skin in the game to actually understand human nature. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as a result of that, They worry about money running out, Catherine. And that's stupid. Money doesn't ever run out, okay? And right now, at the moment, you have this bizarre situation where this morning I listened, because there is a big nerdy economist side to me. And this morning I got up at about 8 o'clock, the governor of the central bank, the governor of the ECB, the chief economist of the ECB, was an Irish guy called Philip Lane, who's a very, very, very clever man. He was giving a webinar, and I said, that's what I'm going to get up and listen to. So I got up and listened to it. And what Philip Lane and the ECB are basically saying to Ireland and Italy and Spain is, we are printing all the money you need, use it, use it. And we're going to charge you 0 interest rates to do it. And please do not let this pandemic overwhelm us. So what we're going to do is you will never run out of money, right? The conversation.
That's very different from what Christine Lagarde was heard to say some time ago, was it not? So is that a change of tactic?
Yeah, Christine Lagarde she's the Konstantin Chernenko of the ECB. Do you remember in the old days in the Russian? If a fella made a mistake, he was taken away. You never see him again, right? So as I've said to you before, I don't think Christine Lagarde really gets economics. That's fair enough. She's a French. She's a creature of the French establishment. She's a lawyer. Lawyers should never be put in command of economics because they believe in contracts. And contracts are things that actually, in good times, you need to honor. Yes. But when the situation changes, you have to renegotiate the contract. So there's no point saying to somebody, the contract you signed in 2004 when you were a multimillionaire, I'm going to enforce on this now when you're living in a caravan. Because you live in a caravan, so you have no money, right? Yeah. So, but what is happening now is that the European Central Bank, largely driven, I would say, much more than people think, by Philip Lane's thinking about this, who is deriving his inspiration from Ben Bernanke, the former chief economist and head of the Fed, who derived his inspiration from his study of the Great Depression, understands that the solution to no money is money. Think about that, right? Yeah. The solution to having no money is give you money, right? And he is saying, we will make money available to every European government. Do with it as you will. Like what he's trying to do, he's trying to save the Italian government. He's trying to make sure that Italy doesn't suffer what they call this downward spiral, where the banks go bust and the government goes bust.
Like
and they
we did back in 2009,
like we did.
We were punished massively.
And the reason we did it was because at the time, the head of the European Central Bank was a French functionary called Trichet, who actually understood no economics at all, who believed that crises were an opportunity to punish people from bad behavior, as opposed to rethink the way you think about the world. So number one, the ECB said you get no money. Number two, we couldn't sell our banks to anybody else because nobody wanted them. Number three, there was no money in them anyway when we went looking for it, right? This is a totally different worldview that is now being not even articulated, it's now been executed.
So is this the courage, the vision and the leadership that you identified that economists need to get us out of this pandemic?
Absolutely. I mean, what people don't seem to realize is getting out of this is not that hard at all. You know, it's a wee bit like thinking of a patient. There's two patients. One is in the normal wing of the hospital, a little bit sick. And the other patient, and you apply a certain medicine to that person. Then the other patient is in the ICU, where you throw the kitchen sink at them, right? Because you know they're in danger. Yeah. So once you understand the economy is in danger, then the medical response, the economic response is totally different. And at the moment, the crucial dilemma for the economy here and in Italy and in Spain and everywhere is a fear that small businesses will run out of money. Yes. And the way in which that fear manifests itself is that all businesses have creditors, okay, people who owe them money and they owe them money. And what happens is in a crisis, everybody thinks they won't get paid. So what they do is they ring people up and they say, you remember I gave you credit for 90 days? You know what? It'll be 15 days. So there's a there's a run on cash.
Panic.
That's what happens, right?
Yeah.
And the way in which in every society you stop a panic is you stop the source of panic. And if the source of panic is the fear that somebody won't pay, then you assuage that fear by giving them money and say they have loads of money. And then the fear disappears. People take a deep breath and they say, okay, you can have those credit lines for 90 days because we're fine because the government is giving you money. The central bank is giving you money. And that's what Philip Lane is saying. But he can't say this explicitly because it's a little bit like a lot of things, Catherine. If a discipline like economics has inculcated articles of faith that it believes are immutable, okay, like the Catholic Church years ago, then somebody comes up and says, you know, that transubstantiation stuff, it's all nonsense, right? The initial reaction is to double down on the dogma.
Yeah, sure.
Because you're threatened, right? This is the same thing. But what is interesting now is the heretics are at the top of the ECB. As I've said before, there's been an Italian takeover of the ECB on the sly, right? It started with Draghi. No, really, there has been. And, you know, there's two ways of looking at money. The Germans look at money as a public good, like fresh air.
Yes.
So that money needs to be protected by treaties, okay? And that it is, and it's pure. Italians look at money as a tool to be used when you're in a crisis, to get you out of a crisis. Okay. So these are two philosophical differences.
Yeah.
And I believe they come from the Renaissance. I think they're much deeper than people think. They're not about Germans and Hitler and inflation. These are much deeper because the Italians understood the power of paper money before anybody else.
Anybody else did. So just one very simple question then. The answer may not be simple, although you do like to say that what is important is rarely complicated. What's complicated is rarely important. How do we pay all of this back? Or do we pay it back? Or what happens all of this massive paper money that comes to take the terror away from everybody?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a strange example, right, about paying back money. The British paid the last installment of their First World War bond 18 months ago.
Wow.
Right? Okay. This is what I would call, this is the magic of financial markets, that you can actually issue, there's a thing called a perpetual bond.
Right.
Like, you know, we're talking about slavery now.
Yeah.
Everyone's talking about slavery now.
Yeah.
And the way in which slavery was financed, what I'm talking about slavery, the abolition of slavery, was exactly the same way as the Land League and the switch in land from Ireland from the absentee landowners to the Irish people was financed. Because basically we kind of forget that in Britain in the 19th century, they believed that Irish land was their property, even though they were absentee, and slaves were their property. And in order for the House of Lords, think about this, to agree to the abolition of slavery, they were paid. Do you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
They were all paid, right? Okay, they were paid. So it was a bribe. So basically some lord says, I've got 5,000 slaves and my mate's got 800 slaves and that's worth 3 million quid and we're not going to vote for this unless you pay us. Exactly the same thing happened with the Land Acts in Ireland, right? So what did the British government do is they issued these perpetual bonds, right? Okay. Which they never paid back because the keys in the money is called perpetual, so it's into perpetuity. So you just pay the interest rate. So interestingly, if you look at all the Coulson stuff about slavery, the way in which slavery was abolished, it wasn't abolished just on moral sentiment. There was a trade, which is horrible to think about.
It is.
And the way they paid it, and the same with the Land Acts in Ireland. You know, the landlords were paid to leave this country. They didn't. They weren't booked out. As we kind of our inner provo wants to think that we did some Bolshevik revolution, kicked them. No, we paid them to leave. Yeah. And how did the Brits pay that? Yeah. They borrowed money, and that's how it's done. Okay, it's the same thing.
I've just had a look at the time. To my astonishment, it's 20 past 8. Do we have any questions, Renata?
Yes, if I can intervene, there is a question by Barbara Francioni, who asked, is it possible, in your opinion, to draw a comparison between the Florence of Dante's time and the Venice of Shakespeare's time as depicted in The Merchant of Venice?
Yes, yes. In fact, we started this conversation about the florin, but Shylock's concern was the ducat, which was the Venetian equivalent. And of course, his whole fear was that he wouldn't get paid for a trade that he was financing. Think about it, okay? So that is amazing. My missus has just come in and given me a glass of wine. Isn't that? She's like, you poor whore, you've been talking for an hour.
Great to have table service.
I'm telling you, that was very sneaky. That was very sneaky. So yes, so and again, let's go to Shakespeare's period time. You know, it's an interesting period because it's Barbara, because it's the beginning of a process whereby the economic gravity of Europe, in Dante's time, the economic gravity was switching from the East, Constantinople, to Italy. Then 100 years later, it switches from Italy to Spain and to the American colonies, okay? And during this period, the gold that the Spaniards got from Latin America, when I say got, which they stole, right? The poor old Spaniards got all this gold and they thought, man, this is much better than working. I'm gonna sit on my bum, which they did. Spain is an amazing example. They got all the money in the world and they blew it all, right? And the people who made the money were the manufacturing industries of Netherlands and England, who were selling them little trinkets and guns and all nails and all sorts of things, because the Spanish stopped working, right? It's a bit like what happened in rural Ireland when farmers stopped working because the land was worth so much. So you had to go out to work, so you can sell that every 2 years and live off it, right? So what Shakespeare's looking at is the decline of Venice, the rise of London as the imperial trading power, and the angst that the Venetians are having, most explicitly through Shylock's anxiety about the trade that he's having. And it's all about banking and interest rates and who gets paid when and all that stuff. So yes, Barbara, I think there is a connection.
And anti-Semitism, or the racism of its day, I suppose, as well, which still with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And anti-Semitism was the stain of the medieval age. I mean, if you look at after the Black Death, the pogrom against Jewish people was so extreme. Think about this, that the Catholic Pope had to intervene, which has never happened before.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the problem with pandemics. Somebody always pays for them.
Yeah. Francesco, do we have more? Another question?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment.
You can ask people if...
Okay. If anybody has another question, just put it into the chat there. So how would you advise us to spend the money? It's more than helicopter money, isn't it? This one, your favorite phrase. It's more than helicopter.
Spend it irreverently and with great haste and with absolutely, and with no taste as well, right?
Okay.
No, I think that, again, the way I understand the economy is definitely different to the mainstream economics. There's no doubt of that. And I look at the economy, so mainstream economics, which I teach in Trinity, I learned all about, is obsessed with this thing called equilibrium. You might have heard this, economists say it's not at equilibrium and blah, blah, blah. So the basic idea of something at equilibrium means it's inert, it is inactive, it's almost asleep.
Okay.
And equilibrium, the economists define as an economy where there's no tendency to change. That's the actual definition.
Okay.
That's their holy grail. But that's all nonsense, because change is life. And the great thing about economics is that it's all much more like evolution, Catherine, than equilibrium. Evolution is this beautiful process of trial and error. So I believe the economy doesn't grow, I believe it evolves. And I believe that there's three things in evolution. One is you start with variance, so lots of different species, and then natural selection, which Darwin never used, okay, selects an advantage that environmentally allows a certain species to live in the environment they find themselves in. And once that advantage is conferred, we multiply, we reproduce, we have babies, right? And that's what evolution is all about. And, you know, I've been intrigued by the evolution of red-haired people, my own tribe. You know, we're the youngest tribe in the world. We're
Really?
only between 6 and 11,000 years old. And we're a mutation.
Wasn't Bodicea a red-headed warrior?
Yeah, she was only a couple of hundred years ago. She was only a couple of years ago. No, but it's interesting.
Come from good stock then, David.
Yeah. But evolution is this battle between folic acid and vitamin D. It's an amazing story, you know, about evolution. But if you think with the economy, so evolution selects certain advantages, it confers advantages, those advantages get reproduced, and that species grows for a while.
Yeah.
And then something else happens, right?
Yeah.
And I think the economies work the same. I think products and companies and ideas go through an evolutionary process. That if the product, for example, why are Italians amazingly good at fashion design? I mean, Florence was the first designer capital of the world. That's what they were doing. It was Armani and Gucci. That's what they were doing. They were making clothes for people with no taste because they've better taste. And they've had it for years, right? And they're still clothing it. But the idea was they started to reproduce what was successful. They abandoned what was not successful. And they focused on these things. So my sense is, to come back to your question about the money, is it doesn't matter what we spend the money on.
Okay.
I know that sounds like a heretical idea. It doesn't matter a damn. As long as we spend it, because the basic rule, Catherine, of economics is your spending is my income.
Okay.
And my spending is your income. Think about it. That's exactly how it works. So if you're not spending, I've no income. And if I've no income, I'm not spending, and you've no income.
Yeah.
So that's the magic of macroeconomics.
Francesco, you're saying there was somebody else?
Yes, we have, sorry, I have lost the chat, sorry. So we have some enthusiastic comments, and we have Adriana, who is the youngest of our students from the first year of the summer school. Adriana, do you want to say directly something to David and Catherine?
Oh, well, since you asked, I was thinking generally about pandemics and this kind of money. And I remember, obviously, Manzoni, because there's quite a similar and yet different situation. He portrays an economic crisis, but I think the point of the whole thing was the lot of unemployed workers and the necessity to travel to another state. That's the whole problem of Renzo, right? So he travels where there's missing out workforce, and then the pandemic kind of resolved the problem. And I don't know, it just came to my mind.
Okay.
Adriana, how are you? First of all, how are you doing? Secondly, Adriana, you know much more about this than I do. Tell me, what is the Manzoni? Is it
yeah, I forgot that maybe it's better now in Italy. Well, we remember him for his main work, Promessi Sposi, and he is one of the most important writers because he set a lot of rules for Italian languages. And when 1861, he was appointed the Minister of Education. No, I don't know. And so he was also one of the theoric of Italian languages. That's why we remember him. But in his work, he describes the situation of Italy in the 17th century. And quando è ambientato come si può? Nel 600. Infatti, 17th century. And he described this massive economic crisis followed by a plague, another outburst of the Black Death.
Okay.
Well, you know what, Adriana, I will have to go to school with you, and you're going to have to teach me all about the economics of a Manzoni.
I think, Igor, did you want to say something?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for this very Insightful conversation, really. No, well, I just have a comment. I totally agree with David when he pointed out the role that Italy played also in the road that will lead to the creation of capitalism in many ways. For example, people like in the Renaissance, in the early Renaissance, people like Cosimo de' Medici, who was a banker, the grandfather of Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent. He was so powerful because he lent money to the emperor, even the emperor, the king of the south of Italy, of Sicily, and so on. And he had a network of banks with agency in Egypt or in Europe, everywhere. It was so powerful. But at the same time, he understood something that today escapes to people like, I don't know, the rich men in the world, that one thing is money, but you really have to use this money. And he understood immediately, also because he was a very learned man, that you have to use, no one will remember you just because you are rich. How many rich people in Wall Street, we don't know anything about them, but everybody knows about Cosimo de' Medici or Lorenzo de' Medici, because they understood immediately that the best use of money was to fund the arts. And they discovered people like Brunelleschi, or they funded Michelangelo. For example, Lorenzo de' Medici decided that the young Michelangelo had to live with him, and he had to fund him from the very beginning, and so on and so on. But going back to the Florence of Dante, Dante was a conservative, really so, and he understood, for example, when he talks about the old walls of Florence. You can still see, if you go to Florence, the old walls where they are. But at the same time, when he talks about the new people, la gente nuova, is pretty much against the new people, who are rich people, who live beyond the old walls, and the new walls were built exactly for these people, so that these people were protected inside the city. And Dante is against them, because he thinks that they will bring, these are basically members of the bourgeoisie, the new bourgeoisie, and he believes that they will change the customs of Florence. And in fact, this is also connected to the idea of the corruption of the church. It's enough to remember Inferno 19 or other cantos, the very cantos that are at the center of the Protestant interpretation, the Puritan interpretation of Dante, according to which Dante is an earlier Luther. And so just to say that I totally agree about your...
Igor, your points are really interesting, because I was saying to Renata, one of the reasons I was intrigued by Dante, in the back of my head somewhere, so I was a very easy victim for Renata, okay, and for Carmen, okay, right, it's good to see you again, was that I studied in Bruges, in Belgium, and the house that I lived in was a student house, and every other student house had these very Flemish Dutch names, Goedergansstraat and Ridderstraat and blah, blah, blah. And I lived in this house called Portinari, and it intrigued me, who is this Portinari geezer? Why was I living in deep Flanders in a house with an Italian name? And then I did a little bit of research. Of course, Portinari was related to Beatrice di Portinari, who is Dante's muse, right? And he was a deeply corrupt banker. In fact, he nearly brought down Medici. He was the Lehman Brothers. The Bruges office of the Medici Bank was the Lehman Brothers of the system. So there is a connection between, and then as you say, they had this extraordinary network going from Egypt, Alexandria, Bruges, London, everywhere, okay? But it's this idea, and I keep coming back to it, that money is an extremely, not even violent, is an extremely positive energy if it's used the right way.
Properly, yeah.
And the reason the Medici was allowed to lend money was what? He was bribing the Pope because, of course, the Pope was obsessed with this thing called usury, where Christians, if we go right back to Saint Augustine, okay, and Thomas Aquinas, okay, usury was the biggest sin that we could commit because money was abstract, and you couldn't take money from abstraction because only God could take money from abstraction. And money also, usury, valued time. And how could mere humans value time when time was a creation of God? So the Italian bankers had to figure out how to bribe the Pope to allow them to remain Catholic and lend money. And what they did was they bribed him. And that's the story. Of course it worked. That's why they were so rich, because they could never have done this in the Gothic period because the popes wouldn't have allowed them. Why? Because the Catholic Church said, or the Christian Church, you can't lend money and take interest, but we can.
Right. Okay.
Maybe
Fascinating.
If I can just add a short gloss to what you are saying. This is absolutely true. And in fact, the sin of Maestro Adamo, who make a false currency, is exactly this, is a sin against God, ultimately, exactly because men are not supposed to do this. And the contrapasso, no, the punishment, as an analogy with the sin, is exactly a metamorphosis. Metamorphosis. Yes. So his own body has to change, and this is what it is taken from Ovid. Ovid's metaphor.
I love this. So this is why he had this big swelling body. I love that. That's great.
That's a contrapasso.
I'm going to rob that idea and pretend it's my own. That's great.
I think there was one more question. Francesco, was there?
Yes, I read the question posted by Chris Williams, who asks, David, what do you think the economic response to a second wave of COVID will be?
Oh my God, Chris, that's a bit concrete. I think, look, I don't know, but it's kind of clear that a second wave is either coming or will be on the horizon. I do not think, Chris, there is any appetite for lockdown. I really don't. I think people have had enough of it. I don't know if that's a right thing or wrong thing, but I can't see there being the same level of lockdown as we've gone through. So then I think, Chris, it's going to be entirely based on if we can do it, contact tracing. I'm not the right person to talk to. I remember, but I met Luke O'Neill, the professor of immunology at Trinity, who's an amazing explainer of the science. And Chris, we were chatting. We just met down to near the other day, and we were having a natter. And I've known him for a while. And I said, "You want to be careful now." I said, because the country got sick of economists after the last plague in 2008, and it'll get sick of immunologists as well. So, Chris, I don't know. I would hope that the next lockdown or the next outbreak is modest. But what do I know? I'm only an economist.
But there's a lot of talk about it possibly being localized, that individual towns might have to go back into some form of lockdown, but that it's unlikely. According to Professor O'Neill this morning, anyway, it's unlikely that we'll have another general one. I think we've time for one more, Francesco, if there's one more question. No? Okay.
We're done.
Perfect management.
Chin chin.
Right.
No, listen, thank you so much. Thanks a million. It was
thank you again, David.
And thank you for shining a light on this amazing period in economic history that I'm a Dante bore. I'm boring my mates. When I go back to the pub, I won't be talking about Leeds United or Liverpool. I'll be talking about Dante,
Well, that's an improvement.
Anyway, it's a date for next year, in fact. So we are still waiting for the other piece we haven't heard about. I don't think all the 7 Ps have been.
We're only halfway through, Renata.
We talk about what pandemics will be like next year. So it's an arrivederci to next year's Dante Summer School, and in presence here in Dublin, really. So thank you very, very much, Catherine, for leading.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
And thank you to David. Have a great time in Florence.
I will. I'll be there now the week after next.
And I'll see you all tomorrow for the third day of this Dante Summer School. The first appointment is at 4 o'clock. And then at 7:30, the event will be in Italian. The 7:30 event, Dante for Everyone, is about performing purgatorial encounters, and it will feature Italian actress and director Romana Montanari, Marco Martinelli, introduced by Edoardo Camurri in conversation with Andrea Porchedo. So it will be very much about theater and how theater has made use of Dante's and has created popularity for Dante. So I'll leave it to you to think about what the many things we have learned today. I don't know if Francesco or Igor would like to add something to this.
Just to remind you that this recorded session will be posted on the website tomorrow morning, and starting from 10 a.m. tomorrow, you will find the new documents, materials for tomorrow that will be devoted to the lecture by Professor Todorovic, who will work on Purgatorio Canti 6 and 9. Thanks again to Catherine and David for this.
Thank you,
Bye.
Francesco.
Thank you very much.
Igor. Thank you,
Thanks,
David.
Catherine.
Thank you,
Cheers.
Renata.
Bye.
Good night. Ciao to everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.
Right.